we have just a couple minutes. We might be getting a few more passengers on board. But, you know, just like a building has a strong foundation, I like to give my tour a strong foundation. So let's do a little prehistory before we get underway. Giants! And now coming up on our right, the current second tallest building in Chicago, Trump International Hotel and Tower. Adrian Smith Architects, Skidmore, Owings & Merrill, 2009. It is a great example of what in architecture we call contextualism, where architects relate to their environment rather than overtaking the neighborhood, fitting in. So look how Smith has setback levels corresponding to buildings around the building there. Now let's look to our left, the influence of the World's Fair yet again. Beautiful building with a cupola dome is the Jewelers Building, 1926. Inspired by a 15th century Italian monastery, the Certosa de Pavia, but built here for the diamond trade. Now back in 1926, you could drive your Model T from Lower Wacker Drive right into the basement. Your car lifted by elevator, you felt safe and secure. Security was a thing, this was prohibition. Alcohol was illegal, but I'll tell you a secret. Chicago was never dry. You could always find a drink in this town. You would go to an illegal tavern called a speakeasy. You had to have a password. And rumor has it, one of our famous legit opens for business in the same spot. Now you might be most familiar with Black Box Modernism. That's the style of building on our right, AMA Plaza, 1972, by the father of American modernism, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, who was third director of a very famous art compound in 1920s Germany called the Bauhaus. Now in modernism, that's where it was born, Mies came to Chicago in 1938 to head up the Illinois Institute of Technology and spread that minimal style around the globe. Who's heard Mies's famous phrase, less is more? Less is more. You see how modernism is a minimalist approach. Because as you look at a modern building, you don't say, there will never be any decoration. That's not allowed. In modernism, you celebrate structure. I'll break it down. Skeleton, skin, space. Skeleton is the frame holding the building up. Skin is the glass curtain wall hanging off the frame. Space is a square. Unless you're the late Chicago jazz man, Sun Ra, then space is the place. That space is usually a square, unless you're the rebel modernist. Bertrand Goldberg never did like squares. Hence his curvilinear Marina City towers, earning their name the Corncob Towers in the 60s. Goldberg had studied at Bauhaus with Mies, but like circles over squares to bring people together. He called that curvilinear flower form. Core-like stem housing elevated utilities. He built the rings like petals from base up. Time and cost efficient, a complete city within the city. With restaurants, bowling alley, swimming pool, bank, you name it. Hey, look at that squat building on our left, 55 West Wacker Drive. You gotta stare at it to understand its style. This is called brutalism. Who's heard that term before, brutalism? Brutalism comes from the French beton brut or raw concrete. Brutalists, when you agree with me, we're basically modernists who have done way too many steroids. Yeah, they celebrate structure. They go a little over the top. The brutalist movement wanted to give your institution a sense of gravitas of lasting forever. That style, very popular sometimes from the university campuses and civic institutions like public libraries. Oh, and I just found a Facebook page I joined called the Brutalism Appreciation Society. And people post pictures of hideous concrete architecture from all over the world. Now, coming up on the right is a good example of what we might call adaptive reuse. I'm a fan of history in general, so I love when you have an old building and it is reinvented for today, right? Why start from scratch and use new materials? This building was sound, so this is the Reed Murdoch Warehouse from 1914 by George Nevins. It is thriving now as an industrial-sized restaurant called River Roast. You will notice it to be asymmetrical if you count the 20-foot arches. There are 5 on the right, only 4 on the left. The 5th they had to go out when the LaSalle Street Bridge was coming in. Widening LaSalle Street, the building came out too far west, so they de-widened it. Lopped off 20 feet. And they made up the word de-widen for the tour. Don't use it in Scrabble. Not a real word. Our bridges were inspired by the bridges of Paris. They'll operate through the 1st of November pretty much. They're called Trunnion Bascule. Bascule is from the French for a seesaw. Each street turning on the Trunnion pin counterweight. You move the counterweight, you can raise a bridge like that in 2 minutes. You find them operating spring and fall for the bookends of the sailboat season. Now, I promised you a true early Chicago school skyscraper. So, 1885, early 1900, Chicago School. Hallmarks. Internal frame, like I've been talking about. You see what a big change that was for the world? Because instead of a load-bearing wall, which had to get 6 inches wider for every new floor, after the fire, when they went with the internal frame, you could really open up the building to natural light. And big windows like that in the building trade became known as the Chicago school window. And now coming up on the right, one of the grandest ideas of Art Deco, the style streamlined that put the roar in the roaring 20s, the 1930 Chicago Merchandise Mart. Now friends, when I say Art Deco, you can think Jazz Age, the Great Gatsby, right? America in the early 1920s was a period of unbridled optimism and prosperity. The country was moving forward, and the architectural streamlined style reflected that idea. You were looking at the largest structure in America prior to completion of the Pentagon. 4 million square feet of space. They had to give that building its own postal zip code. It cost $32 million in 1930. The Marshall Field Department Store commissioned it. They dreamed of a giant wholesale market, woke up to the Great Depression, had to let it go for back taxes. $13.5 million in 1946. Joe Kennedy, father of our late President Senator, picks it up, and I'll tell you how Joe saved that building later. Right now, have your cameras at the ready, 360 degrees, and look around you. We're coming to Wolf Point, the beginning of Chicago. The confluence of the North Branch right, we approach from the east, the South Branch left. We'll be on the South Branch quite a while. It's going to take us 3 weeks to get to our destination, New Orleans, by the way. Did they tell you that at the ticket booth? Good. Okay. Now, look around you. The birthplace of downtown Chicago is a showplace for new architecture. It began with a curved glass building on your left. This is a great example of contextualism, blending in with the environment. 333 West Wacker Drive, the Nuveen building. Everything is about the river. Now, that building was done in 1983. It set the bar really high. It basically said, you want to build downtown, you better bring your A game. You better do your best. And that set the bar, so that's 83. And then look around you, everything else is in the last 5 years. On our right, the Wolf Point Tower Complex. Hey, you know Chicago took a clue from San Antonio, Texas, who was reclaiming their river, the Riverwalk in the 80s, and we said that's what our architect Daniel Burnham was about. Let's bring the river back. And now, you know what? More people want to live downtown than leave the city for the suburbs. So these are high-end residential. They'll get a neighbor right in the middle, Salesforce Tower. For my California friends, Salesforce just did the tallest building in the San Francisco Bay Area. Check out the beautiful River Point building on our right with the arch. Now that's going to be home to our international salt company, Morton Salt. I love it. They have an arch to say we're special. This is where the branches of the river meet, complementing it with a gravel at the top, causing kids to tell me the building looks like a Hot Pockets frozen sandwich. And the sculpture in front is by the great Spanish architect Santiago Calatrava. Now, the very unique building looking like an inverted pyramid, 150 North Riverside, is dealing with constriction. Railroad tracks on the west going into Union Station, the river over here, and only a 2-acre footprint. Nobody touched this lot for 30 years. It's a challenging site. And then Getchen Partners, an innovative firm, completes this 2017 building. They said, we'll give you a building inside of a park for your Riverwalk. See how they solved the small space? Notice they only used 20% of the actual base, 80% for the park. They cut 8 floors in, and then put 46 stories on top of that. Okay, friends, now, if you cut away your outer support walls, what do you think is really holding the building up? You know, they're working on the same principle I've been trying to get back to with all my yoga and Pilates, a strong central core. The third element of the Chicago School are your posts anchoring these buildings underground. They're called caissons, watertight box-like structures filled with concrete. And because the Great Lakes in Chicago here were carved out by glaciers, you want to anchor a building in Chicago, you better listen to the rocker Jeff Beck. You better drill down, 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 110 feet. That's when you hit good. Getchen Partners is pretty busy finishing up the new Bank of America building on our left as well. Now, they tore down a building here called General Growth. It was a post-World War II design. Really, it was modeled after the river barges, which still work the river. Let me tell you, it wasn't that pretty. It was right up against the water, turned its back. There was no room for a river walk. I don't know, they didn't even cry too much when they tore it down. But you know what? The Army Corps of Engineers was working with them, and they said, well, that old building had a bit of historical significance. Can you honor it? And they did. Because look at those corrugated steel plates right at eye level. What do you think those are? The walls of the building they took away. They saved the General Growth building materials and gave it a second life. I always love when new architecture. Well, now you know sometimes to know where you're going in this life, my friends. It never hurts to look back at where you've been. Great Art Deco on either side of us. On our right, the Chicago Daily News building, first building to offer public plaza downtown. And on our left, the Civic Opera building, a perfect marriage of pragmatism and art. They start with the Opera House, surround themselves with corporate towers, and that way you always have revenue still coming in. Notice the typeface, Civic Opera building. It's still building. Pre-16th century Latin alphabet, 23 letters, V and U are interchangeable. So, timeline of architecture in America. Chicago School, right? Late 1800s, early 1900s, 20s and 30s, Art Deco. 1930, after Art Deco, what happens in American architecture? Nothing for 25 years. You know why? The two big events, the Great Economic Depression of the 1930s is followed by World War II. So it's really the late 50s into the 60s when Mies van der Rohe and the Black Box Modernist movement really kick off. Now, Gateway Center, for example, this is an air rights project. Those are Amtrak and Metra trains. Chicago gave the railroads all the free land they wanted, so when you change trains, you'd spend some money in Chicago in the old days. So if you build, you have to buy the air from the railroad and stay out of the way. Looking downriver, 1, 2, 3, 4, this is the evolution of modern architecture over 30 years. It's a time machine. So you know what? Let's set that time machine dial to 65 and 67 for the first two buildings. I'll check the radio from time to time to see if we're in the right era. Superman or Green Lantern, ain't got nothing on me. Yeah, we're definitely in the 60s. And that means pure Miesian modernism. Strip your building down to skeleton skin and space. I turned the dial slightly forward into the 1970s. Well, there's a port on a western bay. Okay, we're in the 70s. And that introduces us to what became known as the international style. See that white building? Wherever you live on the planet Earth, you might have a building similar. Because the international school was the idea of having one homogeneous building, no historic precedent, and you could put the same office building in any country on the globe. Now, you know when that style, international style, was really popular in the 70s, I would bet you a sandwich. I could put you on a jet and blindfold you, and I could have dropped you in any major city around the globe, and at first, you'd have no idea where you were at, because major metropolitan areas started to look the same. Love that little Xbox building. That's the former Midwest Commodities Exchange. That's a truss tube support. What you're seeing is the ceiling columns taken from the inside out, since traders used to communicate with hand signals, financial traders. Now let's turn the dial forward to the 1980s for that mirror building. Don't you want me, baby? And in the 1980s, it's contextualism. Contextualism was a descendant, for those of you who know the term, of postmodernism, which was kind of an over-the-top reaction to the modern movement, where architects started doing silly designs just for irony's sake. Contextualism learned from the postmodernists there's more to life than a box. When Mies van der Rohe passed away in 1969, you got about a decade of people following Mies. You know what happens? People eventually start getting bored with that spartan, austere look. And one thing architects want to blend in with their environment. This building is curved.